Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today I'm talking about perfect 10 out of 10 albums. There's a bunch of links down below. Make sure you check them out. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlists we put together every week, and the Patreon page. Make sure you go check all that out. Of course, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So I guess this is kind of a part 2 to a video that I did way back at the beginning of the year where I discussed 5 perfect 10 out of 10 albums. And that actually all came about from a conversation we had on the Vinyl Den Facebook group about what we thought were perfect albums. And my definition or what I think of perfect albums have always been really kind of limited. I think that there's a lot of really great albums, but very few albums have really kind of reached that threshold of actually being a perfect album. So in that video, there were a couple of obvious choices in that video. I talked I think Dark Side of the Moon was one of the picks I had. And in the comments, people were like, oh, what about this album or that album? And what my response was to a lot of those comments were, it wasn't like an exhaustive list. It wasn't like there's only 5 perfect albums. There's definitely more than that. So I kind of wanted to do a video today, kind of continuing on with what I think are some really great albums that I think are perfect albums. And when I started putting this list together, I didn't want it to be all like obvious choices. Yes, I think Led Zeppelin 4 is a perfect album. I think Hotel California is a perfect album also. But, I didn't want it to be all picks like that. There probably is a couple in here that I've got that are probably pretty obvious choices. But then a lot of other ones where I tried to think outside the box a little bit, maybe dig a little bit deeper and find some really great albums from some artists that are probably more known for other albums, but I think these ones are perfect albums. So my first choice is one of those obvious picks, at least for me. It's an album that I've loved ever since it first came out, but that is Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses. So when this album came out in 87, I was like 8 years old probably when this album came out. And when it started getting big is when I was really kind of starting to form my own musical interests. I was kind of breaking away from a lot of the stuff my parents listened to, and finding other bands outside of their sphere of influence. And this is an album that definitely drove that early period for me. I love this album. I still listen to it today. It's one of those albums I probably have way too many copies of it than I probably should, but just a great album from beginning to end. So the next album is one that I was never a huge fan of this band, but the album came out in late 92, so it was October or November of 92 when it came out. And it was probably a full year before I actually checked out the album and listened to it, the entire thing. There's a couple of big hits that came off, and that's really kind of all I knew. But one of my friends around that time was a huge fan of this album, a huge fan of this band. That's kind of what finally got me into it. And once I finally started listening to it, man, I was really blown away by it. But the album is Automatic for the People by R.E.M. Like I said, not a big R.E.M. fan. I like some of their stuff from the 80s, some of the stuff off of Green, but this album I think is hands down the best stuff that they ever did, and one I still listen to pretty regularly. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was big into punk and ska and things like that. I never was a nu metal fan. I didn't like really any of the nu metal stuff that came out. But the next one is one that, this is probably the only nu metal band that I've ever listened to that I've really enjoyed their music. And this is an album that I think is easily one of the top 5 albums of the 2000s, and that is Hybrid Theory by Linkin Park. I also think this is probably, off the top of my head, probably the best, at least in my opinion, the best debut album of the 2000s, and one that when I first sat down, it was, like I said, I was not a nu metal fan. It's really not my kind of style of music, but I was instantly hooked on this album. The Cure is one of those bands that probably could have had a couple different albums on here. I think Disintegration and Wish, I think, are easily their top 2 albums. But then there's another album that came in right, I think it's just behind those 2. It's equally as great, but I think it kind of flies under the radar. It doesn't get the same respect as some of their other albums do. It's released in 1985, so it was before they got hugely popular. But the album is The Head on the Door, and I think this is an album that it took me a long time before I listened to it, even though I'm a pretty big fan of The Cure. It came out in 85, so it's probably almost 10 years after this album came out that I finally got around to listening to it. And the track, there's a couple of tracks on here that I was instantly blown away by. A Night Like This is one of those tracks that even just looking at this album cover, knowing that the song is on here makes me want to listen to this album. I know I primarily talk about rock music here on the channel, but there is other great music out there, non-rock music, that I absolutely love. The next one's probably my favorite rap album of all time, definitely a 10 out of 10 album, but that is the Marshall Mathers LP by Eminem. When Eminem's first album came out, I thought it was okay, the Slim Shady LP. I thought it was a good album. There's a couple tracks on there I liked. A lot of stuff I kind of really, to be completely honest, wasn't a huge fan of. But when this album came out, it probably took me a good 6 or 8 months to finally get around and listen to it. I was absolutely instantly hooked on the album. Of course, the Real Slim Shady was a huge track on here. Stan was another huge track. But The Way I Am is a great track. Kim is a great track. Kim is probably one of my favorite rap songs of all time. Just a great album from beginning to end. It really could have been a greatest hits album in and of itself. So the next one is one that probably a lot of people out there haven't heard of before, but it's a great album, one I've loved ever since it came out. I think it was 2010 when this album came out. But the album is Watch the Years Crawl By Arthur. So Arthur is a side project of MXPX. But where MXPX is definitely more punk or pop punk or punk rock, whatever you want to call it, Arthur is definitely straightforward rock. Or there's really no punk influence on here. There is some like early 60s rock influences on here, maybe some late 50s rock influences. It's definitely an album that is very different than anything else that they've done in their career. And actually, I've got the signed picture of Arthur up on my wall above my shoulder here. But like I said, great album. This is the only full-length album the band ever released. They did release an EP back in, I think it was 99 when the EP came out. I wish they'd do more stuff, but unfortunately, this is the only one we're ever going to get from the side project. So Jethro Tull is a pretty interesting band because in the 70s, they went through so many different phases. From the late 60s to the early part of the 70s, they're very much blues rock oriented. And that's really the period that I really love. I think this is their best period, even though they got more popular with a lot of the progressive rock stuff that they did in the 70s. The album that I picked from that band, I think it is their best album, their only 10 out of 10 album, is Benefit. So this is their third studio album. This is the one that they released before they did Aqualung. It got really huge and popular. And this album served as that transition period from that blues rock stuff that they did to what they would do a little more progressive-wise on the next couple of albums. And it's one that's always kind of stood out to me above the rest. So when I did that video earlier in the year, I talked about The Dark Side of the Moon being my favorite album of all time. Of course, it was going to be a 10 out of 10 album. And there was people that threw out some other Pink Floyd albums in the comments that they really thought were great albums, and they are. Wish You Were Here, The Wall, Animals, they're all great albums. But I think there's one in their catalog that really gets overlooked. And it's one that I would definitely put it up there with the rest of their great albums from the 70s. And that album is Metal. So this is one that came out 2 albums before Dark Side of the Moon. And it's one that it took me a little while to come around to. It has some more interesting tracks on here. Of course, it's got Echoes, which is probably it's definitely one of my top 3 or 4 Pink Floyd tracks of all time. It takes up the entire second side of the album. And it's one that, it's so many different layers to that song. It's so great, but the entire album from beginning to end is fantastic. I will say that the thing I never really knew about this album, took me a little while to figure it out, was the album artwork, because I didn't realize it was the inside of someone's ear. I always thought when I was a kid it was like a dinosaur or something like that. But great album artwork. Of course, great album also. It's one of my favorite albums of all time. Well, that's all I got for today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what some of your favorite perfect 10 out of 10 albums are. Because that's just some of mine. I could have went on. There's some great stuff from the 80s, some great stuff from the 90s that I think could have been on the video also. Maybe I'll do a third part later on down the line. But let me know what you guys think. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.